Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 52nd webinar in the Offshore Wind Series, Learning from the Experts. I'm Alex Stein, Deputy General Counsel here at NYSERDA. It is my pleasure to be joined by today's experts, Paul Zarnowiecki, Jon Thursby, Adam Griffin, Alfred Weightman, and Mark Christy. Before I introduce our speakers, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. Thank you. Firstly, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please contact Sal Graven at the email address at the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Experts series are available on NYSERDA's website at the address also on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Q&A function and submit your questions to all panelists. Next slide. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goals of 70% renewable sources of electricity and 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select Learning from the Experts speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out a survey also available on our website. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters. Next slide, please. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. All four are partners in Orrick's Energy and Infrastructure Group. Paul Zarnowiecki serves as the office leader for Orrick's Washington, D.C. office, with a focus on offshore and onshore, as well as solar, energy storage, and clean tech transactions. He advises on the development, financing, acquisition, and divestiture of renewable and conventional power projects. He has advised on innovative and complex U.S. renewable energy transactions for over 20 years. Jon Thursby is a projects and construction lawyer based in London. He advises on all aspects of the construction and operation of offshore wind and other large renewable energy projects in established and developing markets. Jon is currently advising sponsors and lenders in connection with the development of offshore wind projects in Asia, Europe, and the United States. Adam Griffin focuses on U.S., domestic, and international projects and other complex financing transactions across the energy and infrastructure sectors, including significant experience with renewable and conventional energy project financings and equity, including tax equity transactions, ESG-related energy and infrastructure financing, and investment transactions, and complex and novel commodities transactions for energy and infrastructure projects. Alfred Weightman assists clients in negotiating market-leading power purchase agreements, PPAs, and helping clients navigate the energy transition. His advice helps buy-side clients to reduce their energy costs and meet their clean energy targets. His experience covers all major European jurisdictions, including Spain, the Netherlands, Poland, France, Germany, Sweden, Italy, and the UK. Finally, Mark Christy is a project finance lawyer with nearly 15 years of experience. He focuses on advising lenders and sponsors on tax matters and tax incentives for renewable energy projects. Well, thank you, and I will now hand things over to Paul.
Alex, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to the NYSERDA team for organizing this presentation, and also thanks to everyone joining today. We're very pleased to be with you. This presentation is going to be covering offshore wind contracts with a focus on power purchase and OREC contracts. We're focusing on how to structure these agreements to manage risk and maximize project success, both for the projects and their owners, as well as the other stakeholders in the projects. We'll talk in terms of US offshore wind, but also draw on our experience in Europe and Asia, including perspectives on project needs for the financing. Next slide, please. So we'll start off with an introduction to some of the key contracts for structuring offshore wind projects. We'll touch on financeability needs for successful projects, as well as on the US federal incentives, tax credits, and grants for US offshore wind. We'll then take a deeper dive into offshore wind contracting, power purchase agreements, and OREC agreements, and then take a further look into structuring PPA and OREC agreements, both to mitigate risk and maximize success for both the project owners and the buyers of the power or the ORECs. We'll include global perspectives, and then we'll be pleased to take questions at the end of the presentation. Next slide. And Alex was kind enough to introduce us, so next slide again. Okay, a very brief word about Orrick. Orrick is a global law firm with offices in US, Europe, and Asia, with a focus on tech and innovation, energy and infrastructure, finance and life sciences. In the offshore wind area, we've been practicing in the US since the very beginning, nearly 20 years, and are actively advising on projects in Europe and Asia. This page, with admittedly very small font on the different projects, gives you a sense of not only Orrick's experience in offshore wind, but also gives you a snapshot of where offshore wind projects are occurring globally. Let me pause there and ask Jon Thursby to provide some additional thoughts about just the global nature of the offshore wind sector.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, as Paul mentioned, offshore wind is now well established in various parts of the world. In Europe, ever bigger projects continue to be developed in established markets like the UK, but more recently in newer markets such as France and Poland. A number of years ago, the market started to gravitate to Asia, with Taiwan being particularly active, and projects are now being developed in Korea, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere in APAC. At the same time, the market has obviously grown significantly in the US, with projects currently in development and construction. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just so you're aware, every year Orrick produces a global offshore wind project, which is really a sweeping review of the global offshore wind market. And amongst other things, it provides a commentary on the trends that we're seeing in the market, which may be of interest to you. If so, the report's available there at the address on the screen. Next slide, please. And the next one. Thank you. Yeah, just by way of context, a very quick canter through the main project agreements that you might come across on an offshore wind project. Starting with the orange box, the developer will likely enter into lease agreements for the offshore site itself and various onshore facilities and possibly port infrastructure too. The developer may also require certain land rights with respect to the cable route, as all cables carrying the power comes onshore. Moving onto the offtake arrangements, depending where you are on the jurisdiction, the developer may have the benefit of one or more PPAs, an Orrick PSA, or some other offtake agreement. And Paul and Alfie will say much more about those arrangements in a moment. And then construction, which is my area. Offshore wind projects are typically procured under what's called a multi-contracting basis, meaning that design, supply, and installation works are procured from a number of different contractors, rather than a single contractor, as is often the case with other technologies. So to take foundations as an example, they might be designed, fabricated, and then installed by 3 different contractors, and that's not unusual. I've highlighted 6 key construction contracts in blue, which cover cables, foundations, turbines, and installation works. But depending on the specific contracting strategy adopted, there could be 10 or even more key contracts. Typically, the contractors will be managed by a project team under a construction management agreement, and that's usually quite a light agreement. Finally, the operations agreements, which are highlighted there in green. Typically, the turbines will be maintained under a service agreement with the original supplier, and that may have a term of anywhere between 5 and 20 years. The rest of the wind farm, so the cables, foundations, and any substations, they'll be serviced under one or more separate agreements. Next slide, please. Thank you. Multi-contracting, yeah, just staying with multi-contracting for a few moments. It's one of those distinguishing features of offshore wind. In the context of building these projects and generating revenue as soon as possible, there are a number of upsides to multi-contracting. Firstly, the developer can select and contract directly with the most experienced and specialist contractors. You're not reliant on the performance or indeed solvency of a single contractor, which is key. The developer has much more control and visibility during construction, meaning it can react quickly and decisively if an issue does arise during construction. Finally, it's usually cheaper as you're not paying a single contractor a premium to carry out the whole of the works and to bear all of that risk. Very briefly, there are a few things to be aware of when multi-contracting. Firstly, there is no single point of responsibility. To put it bluntly, there's no single contractor to blame if something does go wrong. The developer also has to manage what's called interface risk, and that's a term you often hear in the context of offshore wind. By dividing works between a number of contractors, you necessarily create legal and technical interfaces between those contractors, which can increase the risk of a technical issue arising where one component meets another, and potentially incidents on site where you have multiple contractors who are working in close proximity. But all of those risks can be mitigated in a number of ways. Active project management, as ever, is key. Contractual provisions that require those contractors to share information, to attend coordination meetings, and to accommodate other contractors when on site. And finally, contractors are usually required to comply with what's commonly called an interface matrix or an interface register, which sets out in great detail basically who is doing what. And that's an absolutely critical project document. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Sure. So Adam Griffin, and I'm happy to speak about some finance aspects of offshore wind projects before we dive into the PPAs. But essentially, you know, as capital-intensive projects with a long time span of development and construction, and most sponsors and developers will look to finance those projects through project financing. So essentially, you know, financing of the project itself that looks at the risks of the project as it's in development and construction, and then, you know, the revenues that the project's generating when the project's operating. And so that's a mix of debt and equity, and sponsors can think of, you know, whether they want to have different equity providers and how much debt they want to have. But, you know, as compared to onshore renewables, they're obviously typically much larger projects, and there are other projects that are of that size that are project financed. But essentially, you need to consider what is your debt going to require and what will other equity providers require, both in terms of the construction contracts and then the revenue, and how the PPA, you know, interacts with the revenue and provides cash flow that would allow investors to recoup their investments.
Adam, jumping in here, if we can just go to the next slide, please. Go ahead, Adam.
Sure. Oh yeah. Thanks, Paul. And so, you know, one thing that a developer will need to consider is what is the timing and impact of different capital infusions. So what are the needs, and when do you need financing? Typically, you know, debt is not going to be ready until the project's, you know, relatively ready for construction. Although in offshore wind and with the multi-contracting strategies, it's a little bit different than your typical onshore context. And then, you know, another big feature with the tax credits available to offshore wind projects in the U.S. is how to structure debt and equity arrangements that will contemplate tax credit monetization, whether that's tax equity or tax credit sales that might occur down the road and might not be in place at the time you're initially obtaining your equity commitments and debt commitments. And, you know, finally, you know, as you're thinking about offtake and in the context of PPAs, you know, what does it mean for the offtake contract to be financeable? How does it give the investors certainty that they're going to have the revenues they're expecting during the term? And then how does it accommodate schedule relief and cost relief if there are development constraints or variables? And how does it, to borrow John's word, interface with the construction contracts and the timeline and when the project's expected to deliver RECs, power, et cetera? Next slide. And Mark, over to you.
Hi, Mark Christy here. As Adam mentioned, tax credit monetization is an important consideration for financing a project. So just want to touch briefly on some of the major federal income tax credits that may be available to an offshore wind project. In particular, there's an investment tax credit or a production tax credit that may be available. A project would choose one of these credits. The investment tax credit is a one-time tax credits that's earned when a project or the turbines in the project are placed in service, and is based on a percentage of the qualifying cost basis of the project. The production tax credit is production based and is earned over a 10-year period as electricity is produced, and is determined based on a number that is adjusted annually for inflation multiplied by the amount of electricity produced in a project. Both of the ITC and the PTC have a base rate and an alternative rate. The alternative rate is 5 times higher than the base rate. So for the ITC, the alternative rate is 30% and the base rate is 6%. To get the full ITC or PTC, a project has to satisfy what is referred to as a prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements during the construction, alteration, or repair of a project. For the prevailing wage requirements, that generally requires that the workers that are involved in the construction, alteration, or repair of a project are paid wages not less than the prevailing rates in a particular location based on the type of work, and those are determined by the Department of Labor. The apprenticeship requirements generally encourage the use of registered apprentices during the construction of a project, and require, among other things, that a certain percentage of the total labor hours during construction is performed by qualified apprentices. So again, a project that doesn't qualify for these prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements can still claim a credit, but it's at a reduced rate. Also want to mention that the Inflation Reduction Act included a couple of tax credit adders that can further increase the amount of the credit. There's an energy community bonus that's available for projects that are located in specific locations. Generally, that's census tracts where there's been significant fossil fuel related employment in the past and an unemployment rate above the national average. And then there's also an energy community bonus for locations that have had a coal plant closure after 2009. And those qualifying locations are generally listed in IRS guidance. There's also an adder for projects that are composed of a certain percentage of domestic content. In particular, the domestic content bonus requires that 100% of the steel and iron components at a project that are structural and function have to be manufactured in the US. And then a certain percentage of the manufactured products must be manufactured in the US. And for offshore wind, that percentage is lower than some other renewable energy projects like solar and onshore wind, in recognition of the fact that it's more difficult to obtain certain domestically produced components. And lastly, the Inflation Reduction Act also drastically changed the way tax credits can be monetized. The tax credit parties, which expands a lot of the structuring options that are available for projects. And lastly, before I turn it over to Paul, just mention that, in addition to these tax credits, there are also grant and loan opportunities at the federal and state level that may be available to help finance projects as well.
Great, thanks, Mark. Thank you, Mark. So a couple of points coming out of the coming out of those discussions. Number one, just the global nature of offshore wind. Although it's a fledgling industry here in the U.S. It's much more mature in Europe, so there's market standards and there's tremendous amounts of learning to be done. And then there's also a parallel sector in Asia that's that's rapidly increasing in size and scope. Point two, just the complexity of the multi-contracting structure. If you're focusing on ORECs or PPAs, you need to think about that in the context of a much larger suite of project contracting, which is a part of any major infrastructure project, but including and especially offshore wind. Three, these are very capital intensive projects. So when we think about the contracting strategy for projects, you always need to think about them in terms of financeability and an allocation of risk that will be satisfactory to the lenders and equity providers to the project. And then lastly, here in the US, a big component of the economics are the tax credits and other tax incentives available to the projects. And thus the contracting strategy needs to be consistent with the tax credit strategy for the project. Next slide. Okay, all right, so now we'll now take a deeper dive into power purchase agreements and ORECs for projects. OREC stands for Offshore Wind Renewable Energy Credit. So that's the abbreviation for ORECs. Next slide. Okay, all right, so just a word on PPAs, power purchase agreements, and OREC contracts. You need to think about these as a very important component of any offshore wind project because they are the revenue contract for the project. And the buyer of the power or the buyer of the ORECs is the core customer of the offshore wind project. Here in the US, these revenue contracts are broken down into either PPAs or OREC purchase agreements. States that have utilized PPAs, Delaware, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Delaware, the first a project called the Blue Water Project, which was later canceled, was the first offshore wind PPA. And then a number of PPAs have been executed since in these states. And then the three states utilizing OREC programs, Maryland, New Jersey, and of course, New York. Next slide, please. All right, this is a very helpful slide from NREL, which provides a graphic illustration of a utility power purchase agreement where the offshore wind is generating the power, renewable energy credits, and then in some cases, capacity attributes. Those are provided to the utility in exchange for a purchase price payment. And then those costs are passed along to the ratepayer. It's a common structure both in offshore wind here in the US, but also onshore wind and other renewables. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide again. Yeah. Talking a little bit just on the basics on ORECs. So again, ORECs are offshore wind renewable energy credits. ORECs are tradable certificates that represent the positive environmental attributes generated by an offshore wind project. The ORECs are a separate certificate. They're separate from the energy, and then they're under the different programs. They're conveyed either under an order from the utilities, or under a separate power purchase agreement. And then the price is set by the individual state program. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Next slide. Okay. Again, another helpful graphic representation of an OREC structure. This varies a bit between the Maryland, New Jersey, and New York programs, but basically the offshore wind project generates energy and other capacity and other attributes. Those are sold into the wholesale market. For each quantity of energy that's produced, an OREC is produced, and then that OREC is purchased either by the utilities or by load serving entities themselves, or NYSERDA in the case of New York. The cost of those ORECs are passed along to the ratepayers, and then the revenue is either passed along to the purchaser or retained by the wind farm, depending on the structure. And that's a basic overview of how ORECs work. NYSERDA actually put together a very informative presentation earlier this year entitled The Commercial Sale of Offshore Wind Power Generation on July 10th, 2024, a presentation by the Power Advisory, which you can find online at the NYSERDA website. But that's also a very helpful overview of how the OREC program works and how offshore wind projects generate revenue. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll now take a deeper dive into structuring revenue contracts and how to effectively manage risk and maximize benefits, both for the project and for the power purchaser. Alfie.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a few key mechanisms that developers in global markets in particular may be able to use to manage some of the key development risks of offshore wind and some of the market positions we are seeing globally in PPAs. And then after that, Paul will then cover US PPAs and Orrick specific mechanisms in a moment. So firstly, I mean, there's often a mismatch in the timing of locking in construction costs and the signing of a PPA, with the PPA often being signed very early in the development phase. This varies by market, but is often shortly after obtaining interconnection and key consents. This risk is exacerbated for offshore wind due to long lead times, meaning offshore wind developers are particularly exposed to inflationary pressures and supply chain constraints following PPA signature, as we have seen in the last couple of years in several global markets. So what can be done? Many developers are now looking to include price adjustment mechanisms in their PPAs. To mitigate this risk, these adjustments may allow an increase in the PPA price to reflect changes in the cost to the developer of construction. Given this is a fairly new trend, these are often heavily negotiated. However, some off-takers may agree to such mechanisms provided the PPA includes very clear guardrails and protections for the off-taker, which may include a verification process to ensure that any price increase is a true and fair reflection of the increase in construction costs. And so there may be a requirement to an independent audit process to verify that. And secondly, a cap on maximum possible price increases. And some off-takers we have seen push for the possibility of actually reducing the price if construction costs are less than anticipated. Counterparty credit risk is a big concern for both parties and any lenders, and so the inclusion of credit support will usually be a key component of all PPAs. Levels of support will vary, but generally off-taker credit support will cover at least 2 years of generated revenue, whereas seller credit support will often include a step-down mechanism with higher credit support being provided during the development phase due to the greater risks of default in that period, and then with a reduction post-commercial operation. Seller credit support requirements can be significant, often reaching $100,000 per megawatt in the development phase, equating to roughly $20 million for a 200 megawatt offtake, for example. And credit support is most commonly provided in the form of a parent company guarantee or a letter of credit with very strict minimum credit requirements for the issuer of the letter of credit or the provider of the parent company guarantee. The PPA will also seek to provide adequate remedies should either party default in its obligations, leading to termination if those defaults are not cured. So PPAs will generally include robust event of default provisions covering significant breaches of contract or other serious defaults. Non-payment is probably the most prominent risk covered, but failure to maintain credit support and off-taker insolvency are also routinely included. In the event of termination due to an event of default, termination payment will usually apply. The termination payment may be a fixed sum agreed at the outset or a mark-to-market position. Fixed sum termination payments provide certainty, but they do carry other risks, for example, incentivizing deliberate termination where it would be economically beneficial to do so. We more commonly see mark-to-market termination payments, particularly in corporate PPAs, with payments based on the economic loss to the non-defaulting party arising from termination. A number of methods can be used to calculate this, but a core component will be the difference between the PPA price and any replacement PPA price, or in less liquid PPA markets, the forward price of electricity in a market for the remainder of the term. It's worth pointing out as well that the generator will be subject to some additional events of default connected with its operation of the project, the most common being in respect of plant availability. So if the plant is not available for a minimum period of time, usually this is defined on a percentage basis, and for corporate PPAs, we often see a event of default arising if availability is 80% or less for 2 consecutive contract years. Change in law is a hot topic in many markets as well, given the constant regulatory changes being brought in globally, whether those changes are aimed at limiting renewable generation due to changing priorities of new administrations, or to better mold energy regulation to better support a rapid energy transition. Each party will, of course, try and push for change in law risk to be transferred to the other, but more commonly, we see parties agree to share this risk. This is usually done by the parties agreeing to amend the PPA in the event of a change in law to try and restore the economic balance of the PPA when it was signed. We've also seen other structures where the generator or the off-taker takes change in law risk up to a certain threshold, usually measured on a sort of dollar per megawatt hour basis. And for any additional change in law, the risk of increased costs can be shared. And finally, a PPA's force majeure provisions should provide some protection to developers for many events which hinder development or operation which are outside of their control. For example, prior to commercial operation, in the event of extreme weather delay in construction, many PPAs will allow the generator a like-for-like extension for two key deadlines up to a certain limit. Offshore wind projects can generally expect such extensions to be significantly longer than those included in onshore project PPAs, usually at least 12 months. Note that some off-takers will seek to ensure that failure of a contractor, so for example, unavailability of a supply vessel, will not be considered force majeure unless it can be shown that such failure was itself caused by an FM event. Long-term suspension of activities due to force majeure will usually result in a no default termination right, allowing parties to terminate without payment of compensation. And then interconnection delays, finally, are often dealt with in a very similar way to force majeure in many PPAs. So, i.e., there should be delays in the grid connection process, which are the fault of the grid provider. This may also qualify for relief under the PPA in the form of like-for-like extensions to key deadlines, albeit usually with a shorter maximum extension period than may be available for force majeure. Next slide, please. And I'll hand over to Paul.
Thank you, Alfie. So in the U.S. market, there's been quite an evolution over the last number of years, both in the OREC solicitations from New Jersey, Maryland, and New York, as well as in the PPA markets, with a number of new solicitations implementing many of the concepts that we've been discussing to effectively manage and allocate risk between the parties. Notably, there are now a number of PPAs in the market that have been project financed and provide a good roadmap or a good model for the future. Looking specifically at the New York and New Jersey OREC programs, there's been a lot of thought in New York as far on pricing. So the OREC price in New York can be either fixed or indexed. There is a one-time inflation adjustment feature. There is also an interconnection cost adjustment whereby if there's a sharing of interconnection costs, a possibility of sharing of interconnection costs up or down, as well as a potential sharing of future federal tax benefits or incentives to the extent not contemplated at the time, initially for the projects, which effectively passes on a portion of increases in federal support to reduce OREC costs. In New Jersey, there's also a fixed OREC price or a fixed price with an escalator under the New Jersey OREC program. Revenues other than ORECs are credited to the New Jersey ratepayers. There's also potential return of tax benefits to the ratepayers for the value of tax credits and other subsidies and grants not anticipated initially. So there's been you can look closer at those details in the publicly available information from NYSERDA as well as from New Jersey, but there's been quite a lot of thought and evolution going into allocation of economic benefits and risks in the different programs. Other topics that are important and need to be dealt with: inflation, of course, it's a primary issue for the nation that the nation is focused on, but also one that needs to be dealt with and considered in structuring PPAs. The ever-changing landscape of government incentives, also change in law risk, and whether if there are future changes in the permitting of offshore wind, how that's going to be dealt with in your offtake agreement. And lastly, here in the U.S., considering that the sector is still getting off the ground, rapidly evolving, how are schedule considerations baked in and thought about in the PPA, and how are those risks allocated? Next slide, please.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, as with any big energy project, one of the main risks when constructing an offshore wind farm is delay and missing the expected commercial operations date under the offtake agreement, which, as Alfie mentioned, could result in penalties being imposed under that agreement. Very briefly, there are really two types of construction delay that you need to be mindful of. So contractor delay, which could be, for example, I don't know, fabrication delays, and there's developer delay. So that's usually things like adverse weather, site conditions, the type of risks that are generally beyond the control of contractors. And just to add what Alfie and Paul were saying about FM and other schedule relief, there are numerous sort of construction mitigants, if you like. Perhaps an obvious point, but partnering with seasoned contractors who have a track record of performing. Project management, as ever, is critical. Construction float, so ensuring that there's sufficient buffer in the construction program to absorb a certain amount of delay. If the works are falling behind, having them require contractors to accelerate or to go faster. Descoping, if a contractor is really struggling and it's obvious they can't recover their delay, the developer may be able to reallocate scope from one contractor to another. Most construction contracts will also provide that if the contractor fails to achieve certain key milestones by scheduled dates, it will then be liable for delay damages. And ideally, those damages would cover a good proportion of any damages payable under the relevant offtake agreement. Finally, we've seen a trend towards early completion bonuses, so incentivizing contractors to finish early rather than penalizing them for being late. So some more carrot and less stick. So in summary, there's plenty that can be done to mitigate delay risk and thereby avoid those penalties under the relevant offtake agreement. Next slide, please.
So circling back to, what does the offtake agreement mean for the financing? I think now myself and Paul have both mentioned that if it's, and oftentimes it is the primary revenue contract that financing parties are going to look to, they're going to give it a lot of scrutiny and evaluate it from, a number of different perspectives. And so they're going to look at, the pricing structure and any contingencies or variables and some of the ones we've talked about, they'll be looking at those, how those impact cash flows and what they're expecting in terms of recouping their investment. And they'll perform a comprehensive review of the contract as well as with the other construction contracts, but with a particular focus on the PPA. That review is going to be economic, from the banks or financing diligence, and then legal due diligence with lawyers, and then also technical due diligence and making sure that what the developer is constructing is going to be able to deliver under the PPA and have any cushion that people might require as well. And so key other sort of points that the financing parties will evaluate. We talked about adequacy of revenues and ability to meet the obligations and how those line up with the construction schedule and how any delays that could occur under the construction contracts might be factored into the PPA. Do you get relief on your necessity to deliver power if you have a delay on the construction side? And if you don't, what are liquidated damages and ultimately a termination right of the off-taker? And then financing parties and lenders in particular will look at their rights in a foreclosure scenario. If they were to step in on the project, do they have rights that allow them to do that and keep the PPA in place? And what are the terms of those rights that the off-taker might require? Next slide. And next slide, we'll talk about global perspectives on offshore wind.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, in this slide, I think we'll just briefly cover offshore wind offtake in a couple of different global markets very briefly. The UK will speak a little bit about more in the next couple of slides. Germany is an interesting market. It's the second sort of biggest offshore wind market in Europe. They're interesting because there's been a huge amount of competition for offshore wind development in Germany, which has essentially driven down the premiums that developers are willing to pay to zero. And actually, there's been a couple of instances in the last couple of years where developers have actually been paying significant amounts of money, sometimes in the billions of euros, to secure development rights. Although billions of euros is a very large sum, it is worth noting that only 10% of that is due up front, and the rest of it can be kind of amortized across the subsequent years. But nonetheless, interesting that developers are willing to undertake development without any state subsidy whatsoever. There's probably still a little bit of uncertainty as to how those projects will develop. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of reliance on corporate PPAs, but Germany does have a strong corporate PPA market. So I think it's overall a very buoyant, positive market. But time will tell to see whether those developers who have chosen to fork out very large amounts of money will be able to recoup their investment. Japan and Taiwan are pretty similar in the sense that, again, similar to Germany, there's been such intense competition that premiums for developing offshore wind have been driven down close to zero. Taiwan has a very strong corporate PPA market, so I think there's a lot of confidence that actually corporate PPAs will be sufficient to allow developers in Taiwan to meet the required returns. Perhaps in Japan, there's a little less certainty just because onshore solar prices are so low in Japan that it might be trickier to persuade lots of corporates or other off-takers to pay the premium required for offshore wind. And then finally, South Korea, just a flag, it has a simple fixed price REC contract as the main form of government support there. Next slide, please. So the UK, we think, is a great example of a generally successful offshore wind market. It's got more offshore wind than any other country except China, and so we felt it to be worth spending a little more time on the UK market to better understand how this has been achieved. The CFD scheme, which stands for Contract for Difference scheme, is a primary tool for incentivising offshore wind development in the UK, and has been in place now for over a decade, since 2014. I'll very briefly describe what CFD is before we get into a bit more detail about how the CFDs have really incentivised the market in the UK. But CFDs are essentially awarded to renewable generators pursuant to an annual auction. Government will impose a maximum price at which bids must fall below, which essentially is to allow the government to control their costs, which is particularly important as the scheme is funded by consumers as a component of their energy bills. But the CFD is essentially a long-term contract between the generator and the government. It's purely a financial instrument, meaning there's no purchase of power or RECs by the government. And the generator sells the power at a variable market price into the wholesale market. And the agreed strike price, and then payments are made based on the difference between that variable wholesale price and the agreed strike price, including a requirement the generator must pay back the difference to the government when the market price is higher than the strike price. So looking at a few of the mechanisms, the risk management mechanisms, to see how they've helped stimulate the offshore wind market in the UK. CFD pricing is fully index linked for 15 years. So this insulates generators from inflationary pressures to an extent, but will certainly not remove risk of construction cost increases. The CFD provides very strong change in law risk, with government recognising this is a key risk which drives up developers' cost of capital. And actually, one other key point worth mentioning here is that in some markets, generator balancing costs are becoming an increasing concern for developers. And we've seen sharp increases in balancing costs as more and more intermittent renewable generation comes online, causing the total cost of balancing the system to increase. And so to mitigate this risk, generators also get some protection from increases in balancing costs by allowing an annual adjustment to the strike price to reflect any increases in balancing costs over each year. In combination, I think these two mechanisms really help ease the financing case for CFD projects and really help drive down the cost of capital, which has the added benefit that it allows developers to bid in at lower prices, which reduces the overall cost of the scheme. The CFD is structured in a way which gives developers the flexibility to follow a revenue stack approach to its offtake. For example, by securing a CFD for some but not all offtake capacity, and adding corporate PPAs to the remainder. And we have seen some developers take advantage of this in recent years. This can be helpful as we discussed previously, some off-takers will accept slightly more flexible terms for large offshore wind off-take, particularly in respect of pricing. And PPAs may also put off-takers more of an opportunity to benefit from high merchant prices, whether in the form of a merchant nose, so a short period before the PPA becomes fully effective, where the developer can take advantage of high merchant prices, or some form of upside sharing, where the developer retains some of the benefit from high merchant prices whilst the PPA is in place. And then finally, the CFD is now, as mentioned, it's been in place for over a decade, so it's a long-term proven offtake strategy. And the UK does have a general policy of grandfathering, which is to say, they aim to ensure existing CFD holders are generally protected from later changes to the scheme, which could undermine their investment. And this has been vital to ensure investor confidence in UK offshore wind is maintained. Next slide, please. So before we wrap up, we felt it's worth just considering some key takeaways or lessons that can be learned in developing government offtake schemes and some of the mechanisms such schemes could deploy to help developers manage risk. So providing index-linked pricing support reduces inflation risk, allowing developers to lock in financing more cheaply. However, it's probably also important that governments ensure budgetary controls on levels of support on the levels of support available. This can be a tricky balance to find, as some schemes will only work in the long run if they do provide good value for money. And so mechanisms which protect developers from low merchant prices whilst allowing the off-taker or government entity to share in the benefits of high price periods seem to work well and are generally accepted by developers. Tailoring the scheme to ensure it provides the right level of protection against key project risks is vital. This should provide reasonable protection from changes in law, increases in balancing costs where applicable, and force majeure events, all of which are generally outside of the generator's control. Although I think it's probably tempting to tailor terms to ensure maximum risk allocation to the generator vis-a-vis the government, I think this can backfire when the risk allocation just means developers need to price their bids higher to take on the risk, increasing the cost of the scheme. And finally, the economics and risks of renewable development are constantly changing. So this means the approach to providing offtake support needs to also be constantly updated to ensure strong pipelines of projects. If the economics don't stack up, offshore wind development will not progress. A good example of perhaps what not to do is the UK CFD scheme in 2023, which set a maximum strike price that was far too low and which didn't fully reflect the cost increases and inflationary pressures that developers were experiencing. So this resulted in 0 offshore wind bids that year, negatively impacting the timeline for the UK meeting its offshore wind targets and reducing confidence in the sector. Any pricing constraints should therefore be very carefully analysed to ensure they are fit for purpose and properly reflect the nature and size of development risks at any given time. And so strong engagement and consultation with industry will be key. And similarly, countries need to be careful to ensure that strong competition to secure rights for offshore wind projects, as we've seen in Germany, Japan and Taiwan, for example, do not drive down prices or support to the point which puts those projects at risk, particularly given continuing economic uncertainty and risks of continuing high inflation. This may be a risk in those countries, as you mentioned, like Germany, where we have seen negative bidding and 0 price bids, which may mean heavy reliance on corporate PPAs, and so may pose some risk where corporate power demand is not sufficient or where corporate PPA pricing is too low. Next slide, please. Right, I'll just hand over to Paul for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as noted at the beginning of the presentation, there's a strong global outlook for offshore wind. Certainly the scale and the project development timeline of these projects requires careful planning, structuring, and then risk mitigation and allocation amongst the stakeholders. Here in the US, offshore wind PPA and OREC structures need to address these market and sector challenges. Learn from past offtake exercises here in the U.S., but also learn from the global market sector, including the mature market in Europe and the rapidly evolving markets in Asia. Successfully structuring offtake contracts, PPAs, ORECs, is going to be one of the keys to unlocking the power of offshore wind here in the U.S. and globally. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Alex and to the NYSERDA team.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and I am glad you guys joined us. So we do have a few questions that we have about 10 minutes to cover, so I'll try to move quickly. The first question is about curtailment, and I'm going to kind of sum up the question by saying the questioner kind of understands that some contracts in some jurisdictions, perhaps the UK, provide protection to the developer for curtailment. And can you speak a little bit as to how that's handled either in the UK or in other places? And if curtailment is not protected, does that mean that the developer will have to assume that they would lose a certain amount of their production and sort of bid accordingly to sort of build that into their bid?
Yeah. And Alfie, maybe you can start in the UK. And you're on mute, Alfie.
Thanks, Paul. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just saying in the UK, generally, there are protections from curtailment. So if a generator has to curtail a project because, for example, there isn't the transmission capacity available to export power from the project to the grid, they'll be required to curtail the project under what's called the balancing mechanism in the UK. And they'll be essentially paid based on how much power they would have generated in that period. So the aim is to try and essentially keep them whole based on the generator's view of what price it would need to be paid to curtail in those periods.
And then here in the U.S., it's going to vary between the PPA structure or the OREC and which state we're talking about. But as a general matter, ORECs are produced from the megawatts of energy generated, and then in a PPA context, the purchases are made based on the power generated. Therefore, if you don't have products, you don't have the revenue, you don't have the purchase and sale component. The project operators and generators need to then factor in, anticipate curtailments and the level of operating efficiency of the project in order to structure the contract and the revenue stream so that it's sufficient for itself and for its financing parties.
Perfect. Thank you. Great answer. So another question from the folks listening: when we talk about change of law, is that the kind of provision that could potentially build in something like a protection against tariffs? How would you see tariffs sort of being dealt with in an offtake contract?
Yeah, so this also again will vary between the different PPA solicitations and the different OREC programs, but it's very much a topical issue here in U.S. renewable energy PPA contracting. Obviously, with the change in administrations, you're seeing some different changes in the regulatory landscape. You've got changes in tariffs, so there are a lot of moving pieces currently as we head into 2025. It's very much on the minds of buyers and sellers in U.S. energy renewables, and in some cases there are provisions specifically being put into power purchase contracts here in U.S. renewables to address that risk and to allocate it amongst the parties. It's very much project specific. It depends on the types of equipment, the types of technology, who the buyer is and who the seller is, but it's very much on the mind of U.S. renewables buyers and sellers, and it needs to be factored into new OREC and PPA contracts that are being contemplated or executed in 2025 and beyond.
Great, thank you. So can you speak a little bit to how PPAs and offtake agreements generally deal with negative pricing risk for developers?
Yeah, Alfie, I'll let you jump in here if you're able.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, negative pricing risk will be treated slightly differently depending on the form of offtake contract. So taking corporate PPAs as a good example, for virtual corporate PPAs, generally the off-taker will not want to be exposed to full negative pricing risk, particularly in Europe, where I think negative pricing risk is becoming much more prominent as more renewable generation comes online, particularly during periods of high solar generation. That's caused sometimes the sort of wholesale prices to really drop, and in some markets quite regularly drop below zero. So for virtual PPAs, corporate off-takers will generally require a zero price floor, meaning that their maximum exposure under the sort of the CFD mechanism as part of a virtual PPA will be the PPA price. For physical PPAs, where there's actual physical delivery of power, I would say generally it's the developer will want a curtailment right. Sorry, the off-taker will want a curtailment right. And really that's just because that's just so they can benefit from those negative pricing, those negative prices under their energy supply contract. So generally the off-taker has signed a PPA to buy power at a fixed price, but under its supply contracts, when prices are negative, they will actually get paid to consume power. So if they can buy less power under the PPA during those periods and consume more from their retailer, that can be a big commercial saving for off-takers. But clearly, very heavily negotiated points in most PPAs.
Perfect, thank you. So here's a question that is more about process, I think, than substance, if you will. So after the competitive bid process has completed, can it be difficult for states and regulators to amend the offtake contracts with developers? So in light of that, are there timing considerations for when bidders should submit comments as to how the contract is drafted?
Yeah, so just jumping in on that one, I think it does become difficult when you've got a large public solicitation to then go and change terms and change structures later. So what that would argue for or suggest is that it's very important to comment on solicitations and be an active part of that process prior to the solicitations being drafted to the extent possible, so that the specific concerns for an individual project or the sector generally can be surfaced and dealt with prior to solicitation being granted or being launched in an ideal circumstance.
Excellent.
And I think that extends obviously beyond offshore wind to onshore renewables and power solicitations, both here and globally.
I certainly agree with that. Well, that's fantastic. I think we're going to wrap up there. So let's, if I could please see the closing slide, and I will wrap us up. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. I do have a reminder that the webinar recording and presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. We are planning more webinar topics for the coming months, so please check back soon at wind.ny.gov for any registration information for those. And we also encourage you to check out past webinars, as well, including the one that Paul mentioned earlier, in the series on NYSERDA's website and YouTube channel. If you have any requests for future topics you would like to hear about in this series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our website. Thank you very much for joining us today, and see you next time.